Hello, in this video we're going to talk about environment lighting inside of Zbrush. Now if you've watched the introduction to materials and rendering, you'll understand things like the BPR renderer and changing your shadow settings and transparency. If you've watched the keyshot video, you'll understand that if you can actually connect the external renderer keyshot to Zbrush and do your renders outside of Zbrush. However, I wanted to dedicate a chapter to showing you how you can take high-resolution background imagery and use it to light your model by generating lights based on that HDR image. This is a final render of a skull model that's being lit by this photo of a Parisian street. So let's take a look now at how we do this. I'm going to go ahead and reset ZBrush, and we'll start from the base model and build up this scene from the beginning. So here we have our So here we have our model of our human skull. Now this is a decimated mesh, and it's got enough detail that it can cast some nice shadows and give us a good result with our rendering. Now we could go into our light menu and we could light this with the standard ZBrush lighting and get a good result. But what some people like to do is use a spherical HDR image to generate light caps. Light caps are when ZBrush goes and examines this image and then samples different points to create lights based on the lights that are actually in the image. So you're essentially using an image to light your model. So let's take a look at how this works. If we go to the light box and then go to the texture menu, you'll see that under the texture menu we have a variety of different textures. It's going to take a little bit of time for this to load. Now underneath here we have panoramas. If I load this folder, these are the lighting images that we can use. There's a variety of them here. This is the one that that I really like. This is a sort of a French street. There is a museum image here, and this is the one that we're going to start by using. We're going to start by placing the skull in a museum setting, and then we're going to create light caps based on that image of the museum showroom to light the skull so it appears that it's actually in that space. So let's take a look at how this works. So let's leave the light box, go to our light menu, and under background, you see we've got the option to load a background environment texture. If I click that, it's going to load the texture palette. Now, by default, we already have that museum HDR image loaded up into our texture palette. So if I just select that, it's going to load that into our viewport. Now notice as I rotate around, I can see the entire room. Now I'm going to zoom out. Now the room stays put, but I'm going to adjust this to make the skull sit on this plinth. Now if the perspective seems wrong, you can go to your draw menu and you can adjust your focal length. Make that line up, oops, not like that far. Make that line up a little bit better if you like. Maybe we go to 28, 24. Let's actually go back to draw. I don't really like the look of that, so I'm going to go back to 28. And then I'm just going to line this up with that plinth and just try and get it feeling like an accurate scale to the rest of the room. We're very lucky that we have this plinth here. It makes it very, very easy to line our object up. Now, once we've got the object sitting where we want it in relation to the rest of the environment, we're ready to go forward. So let's go back to our light menu and we'll tear this off to the side of the screen. Now you'll see that this is set to rotate with object. That rotates the background with the object. That's the default setting. If I turn that off, I would rotate the object, but the background would remain in position. Now these control all the settings of this background image before we generate the light caps from it. Generally, you can leave these as they are. The exposure and the gamma both look fine. I don't feel that I need to blur it. The most important setting here are samples. And if you look at the tooltip, this controls how many lights are generated. 0 is 1, 1 is 2, 2 is 4, 3 is 8, 4 is 16, and 5 is 32. Now what this means is ZBrush will analyze this image and it will pick out points from it to generate light. So this will cast a nice diffuse white light. This will bounce a nice sort of greenish tinged light. Down here we would get a warm bounce light. So all these different points in the image, depending on how many samples you've set, are going to end up getting a light cap generated for them. So let's go ahead and leave samples at 3 because that's going to give us 8 lights, and we will click Create Light Caps from the environment map. And there we go. It has now generated lighting based on that image. So let's look now at how we can actually adjust the light cap. If I go to Light Cap Adjustment and Light Cap, I can open these two menus here. Now, the light cap adjustment, oops, let's scroll down a little bit. Light cap adjustment here has a button called Use Material Curves. I will click to turn that on, and what that does is it allows the material curves that are set under your material settings here to control the effect of the light on the surface. Now, if I come up here, I've got my individual light indexes. This is under the light cap menu. If I go to light 1, it will light up light 1, which is right there. If I go to light 2, it will show me light 2, which is here. It's the one that's lit up red. Now, as each light is selected, I can change the settings for that particular light here. Each light has a strength control and a shadow control as well. Now, you might find that you want to turn shadows off on some of these lights. Because there's so many, you might find yourself getting crossover shadows that are not visually appealing. In that case, you might go to the shadows or the lights coming up off the ground and disable shadows on those and just cast shadows from the skylight. So this allows you to have an extreme level of control over all the different variables for each individual light as you scroll through the light index. And the sphere here, this is going to show you what the actual light cap looks like. We can set it to specular or diffuse. Here on the diffuse, you see that we've got the warm light down here at the bottom. That's the floor plane, and we've got the light, white light up here, which is the skylight that we see up here. So if we want to do a global adjustment to our exposure, we could do that here, and that will change the overall exposure. Right now it's at 0.18. If I were to turn this down, it would adjust that exposure for all the lighting. If I turn off material curves, the skull might appear quite blown out. And we can adjust our exposure now using these curves. And notice that as I increase the exposure, you can really see that white light at the top of the screen, the neutral light at the center, and the warm light coming off the bottom. So this is the lighting that's generated from this image. So let's go ahead and turn this back down. Then we can make that much, much less blown out. Now, my preference is to use material curves. So I'm going to turn material curves back on. And then we can adjust exposure like this. There we go, and you can see it update on the model. So let's go ahead and set it to, let's put it back where, well, let's leave it at about there and see how this works for us. So now we're ready to do a BPR render. So I'm going to click BPR, and because we've generated 8 lights, it might take a little bit of time to render. So I'm going to start the render, and then when it completes, we'll come back and look at the final result. Rendering now, and you see that it's starting to generate shadows and rendering. And here the render is complete. So we have these nice cast shadows here. The only sort of problem I have is the shadows seem quite harsh. So here's how we'll fix that. We'll go to Render, then open up BPR Shadow, and turn our angle up, and turn our rays up. The angle will soften the shadow edge, and increasing the rays will increase render time, but it will soften any sort of banding in those shadows. So let's BPR Render again and see the result that this gives us. And here is the result of that change. You see that those shadows have now considerably softened. Now I do want to remind you that if you've got crossing shadows that you don't like, you can turn off some of your shadows. So if I go through my light index here, and let's go to light 1. Light 1 is right here, which I'm actually okay with that casting shadows. Light 2 is down here. I think what I want to do is I want to try and get rid of maybe one of the shadows on either side there. So let's go to our light 3. Now, light 3 is up here. Let's see what happens if we turn shadows off on this one. Let's go to light 4. You see light 4 is this one up here, and we'll let that one continue to cast shadows. Light 6, that's already set to no shadow. Light 7, right there, we will, well, just to see the difference, let's turn off the shadows on that. So we've just turned off shadows on 2 of the lights. So now let's run our render one more time, and then we can look at the difference between the two once it's finished rendering. And here is the resulting image. Now you see that it's softened the shadows, and we don't have quite so many overlapping shadows now. I would probably want to get rid of this one here, so let's go ahead and just go through our light index again and see. Light 7's there. We've turned shadows down to 0 on that. Light 8 is down here, and shadows are already at 0. Light 6 down there with no shadow. Light 5 is up here. And let's turn shadow down on that. Now we don't have to turn it all the way off. We could just reduce the shadow, but let's turn it all the way off just so we can definitely see what happens. Now we'll go ahead and render one more time and check the difference between the two. And here we can see the resulting render. We've removed shadows from one side and they are now on the opposite side. Now, if you find that your shadows are not lining up where you want them to be, let's say for example on the grid, if I go to draw and go to our grid size, let's see, grid size. Sometimes your grid can be larger than the surface that you're trying to cast shadows on. If that is the case and you're casting shadows over the edge of this plinth, just adjust your grid to take up only the plinth, and that way you're going to get your shadows, there you go, where you want them. We can actually bring that down a little bit more, and 1.2, no 1.4, no 1.2. There we go. So you can get your grid lined up as close to the surface in the image as possible, or the floor plane where you actually want to be casting shadows. Now, let's take a look at how to load up another HDR image. For light caps, I will go to the image button here, and you see that this brings up my texture menu. I need to load up a new light cap or a new light image into the texture menu. So I will go to the light box, texture, and here we are in our panoramas folder. And let's go ahead and open up that French street. If I double click this, it will load it into the texture palette here. There we go. Now if I go to my image and I select that image, I can replace my background. So now we can rotate. Now remember that I have set it here under light cap. Now here we go, rotate with object. So I can rotate the background with the object so I can get the background placed. There's that beautiful, there's cathedral spires back there. So let's lock the background by turning off rotate with object. Now we can scale and place our skull here in the middle of the street. So there's this quite a large skull sitting in the middle of the street here. Let's go ahead and place that there. Now, if I want to make sure that I don't accidentally move it, I can lock the camera, so that's not going to allow me to move the skull again. That can be really handy if you're trying to render and compare. You don't want to move your skull or your object in the middle of your render sequences. So let's go ahead now and create new light caps. I will go to light caps. Now we did 3 lights, or 3 samples, so that's 8 lights. Let's turn it all the way up to 5 samples. Now 5 samples is going to give us 32 lights. This is going to take a long time to render, but it'll show us the maximum abilities of the light cap controls. So I'll click light caps, and this will generate a brand new light cap down here. There we go. Now you see it's changed the image and it's added many, many, many more lights here. Here we can see our blue sky. Down here we see the warm electric light reflecting off the street and the gradient in between. So we're going to leave it to use material curves, and I am going to start rendering. So I'll hit BPR render. Now there's 32 light caps here, so this is actually going to take a fair bit of time to complete. So I will pause the video once again, and then we will come back once this is finished, and you'll see it jump between this raw image and the final render image.